So at this point, let's think of the blue and yellow layers as paper layers. And so with this stencil ready, we're ready to apply the stencil to the blue piece of paper, which will in turn cut out of the blue piece of paper any areas that you see here on our stencil that are black. To actually apply the stencil, let's go ahead and select the blue paper thumbnail. And there you go. We've just applied our stencil to our blue piece of paper, or our blue layer, to reveal the layer below. Again, anywhere that you see that is black on our layer mask happens to be the cutout of the stencil itself, or the layer mask itself. Now let's talk about working with layer masks. To really see these cutouts on this blue layer, or this blue piece of paper, go ahead and select the little eyeball icon next to the yellow paper layer, which happens to be the visibility icon there. We're going to turn the visibility of the yellow paper layer off. Notice the cutouts. Again, because we applied the stencil and used the stencil on the blue paper layer, again, the stencil is our layer mask itself, we've then cut out shapes, so to speak, from our blue paper layer. And I'm going to turn back on the yellow layer visibility. And now, if you place a layer directly below one that's been cut out, you see the contents of the layer below, which is the yellow layer. So let's think about this for a second. The layer mask is the entire masking film itself, and the black and white areas are the areas that either were or weren't cut out. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about modifying our layer masks, because remember I had mentioned layer masks are non-destructive to a layer. So remember how we're thinking of layer masks as a stencil? Well, let's now think of layer masks as a stencil that we can repair and basically undo some of the cutouts to the stencil itself. Let's go ahead and do that. Go ahead and hold Alt on your keyboard and click once the thumbnail of the layer mask itself. Now, let's say that we want to repair our stencil or modify it in some way. Well, to do that, you only want to work with two colors when you're working on layer masks. Again, black and white. Let's basically get rid of some of our cutouts of our stencil. To do that, we could use quite a few different tools here, but let's go ahead and select the brush tool for this for the time being, and then let's get out a nice size brush. Something about 100 pixels across, and let's bring the hardness all the way up to 100%. Okay, now I'm going to press Enter to get out of the drop down menu there, and now I'm going to press D on my keyboard for the default colors. Remember, D for default will actually make the program select white as your foreground and black as your background. D and X are both very useful tools when working on layer masks, because together pressing D first and then X only allows you to work with black and white. Okie dokie, so now we've just pressed the D key on our keyboard and not the X key, which will give us the default colors. I'm going to repair my stencil. Let's say I didn't want this star here. I'm going to start painting away. This will get rid of the cutout for the stencil itself. And let's say I would rather not like this paw down here. So I'm going to paint white to repair the stencil. And remember, white in our case happens to be the flexible plastic that makes up the stencil. And let's say I'm only going to partially delete this rectangle here. And again, we're not really deleting, we're just repairing or modifying the cutouts with white as our foreground color, which will add plastic to our stencil cutouts, so to speak. Okay, now let's see what this has done to our layer mask. Go ahead and click once the blue thumbnail, that is the blue paper thumbnail within the Layers panel. And this happens to be our new stencil applied to our blue paper layer. So we've done our cutouts to the blue paper layer, and now we see the new stencil applied to that layer and the layer below it showing through where we've cut out. Let's go ahead and turn off the yellow paper layer and take a look at what it looks like when you just see the blue paper layer and its cutouts. That's what the stencil did, or the layer mask. So notice in our case, layer masks are non-destructive to a layer. Now let's see when we have something else below our blue layer showing through. Go ahead and turn off the yellow paper layer as I did by clicking its little eyeball here, and notice I have no more eyeball. That would turn off the visibility of that layer, and then click the background layer's visibility on by selecting the little area for the eyeball there. And now take a look. We start to see some of the background layer showing through, which happens to be a graphic. Let's see more of this graphic. So I have a question. Without having to turn off the blue paper layer's visibility, how would we then see more of the graphic that's showing through the cutout areas? Well, we'd access our layer mask or our stencil and make larger cutouts so that we can then see what the background image is below the blue paper layer. Okay, so remember how we held Alt and clicked our layer mask? Well, did you know you don't have to do that? We just did that so we could see the black and white. However, at some point you'll get to understanding that when working on layer masks, you only work with black and white. Black to reveal and white to conceal the cutouts. So that being said, there's no need to really press Alt on your keyboard and click the layer mask itself. We're just going to now at this point select the layer mask, knowing that we're only going to be working with black and white on it. Now if we wanted to reveal the layer contents below, that means we're going to need to make a pretty large cutout. So to make a large cutout, remember we must have black set to our foreground color and just make a simple large cutout. And with our layer mask selected, we're then able to edit the stencil or the layer mask automatically. So notice the layer mask is selected. It has the white outline around it, so we know we have it selected. Now let's go ahead and get out black as our foreground color. Remember, that's D on the keyboard and then X to exchange the foreground and background colors. Let's try that again. D for default colors, which is white is foreground, black is background, and then X to exchange those colors. Also, these little icons up here do the same thing. D, notice if you roll over it, it says default foreground and background colors, and then X, which is switch foreground and background colors. Either way, now we have black set to our foreground color. And let's keep that brush out. Okay, now let's start to paint with our brush. And notice we are starting to see the image below. We're revealing the image below by adjusting the cutouts of our layer mask, or the area that is black of our layer mask. Now go ahead and do something like this, and then let go of your mouse. And notice your layer mask updates within the Layers panel to give you a better idea of what's going on visually with that stencil. Let's go ahead and take a look at our stencil or our layer mask by holding Alt on our keyboard and clicking once on that layer mask thumbnail. That happens to be our new stencil cutout. Pretty wild, huh? So again, black is the area that we use to cut out the contents of the blue layer. And again, white is the plastic of the stencil itself. Now let's talk about blending two layers together using a mask. Okay, so remember how I said that layer masks only use black and white? Well, technically that's not true. Technically, layer masks can also use shades of gray. But when you work on layer masks, you want to use full black to do the cutouts and full white to undo those cutouts or add plastic to, if you're thinking in terms of this as a stencil. However, the only time that I use the shades of gray on a layer mask is when I'm doing something called layer blending, utilizing layer masks. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's make sure that we are in default color mode. So press D on your keyboard to get those default colors. And now let's get out our gradient tool. Select your gradient tool, and then let's make sure the options for the gradient are as follows. We want to choose a gradient that gradients from black to white. this third one in from the left. Go ahead and select that one. Then let's go ahead and select the linear gradient icon. Any one of these gradients will do, but let's all select the linear gradient icon here. Make sure your mode is set to normal, your opacity is 100%, and I'm going to uncheck reverse, but yet make dither and transparency checked. Okay, so your options should be set to my options. And now let's begin right above here and click, hold, and drag from the top on down to the bottom of your image. And let go. Notice this nice gradient shade that includes black and white and shades of gray. Okay, so now let's see what this has done to the blue paper. Go ahead and select once the blue paper thumbnail there within the layers panel, and this is the layer mask applied to the blue paper layer. Very gradual. And because the stencil was so very gradual, the transition here is very gradual, and it blends well with the layer below it. Well, you're probably thinking the yellow paper layer happens to be the layer below the blue layer. However, the yellow paper layer's visibility is off. So let's go ahead and turn on the visibility of the yellow paper layer. And this happens to be what you get when a gradient layer mask is applied to the blue layer with the yellow paper layer showing through. A nice gradient shade from yellow to blue. Let's again take a look at our layer mask by holding Alt on our keyboard and selecting the thumbnail that is our layer mask, just by clicking it once. Now notice, black is the cutout area, white is the plastic area, and the shades of gray are kind of a transition between cutout and plastic. So if black is the cutout area, then the top part of this blue paper layer should be cut out. And when you select the blue thumbnail, take a look. It is cut out. So to really understand this, let's go ahead and turn off the two layers below the blue paper layer by selecting the little eyeball icon and turning that visibility off. And now notice, this happens to be what's really going on behind the scenes with the layer mask applied, and no paper or other layers below the layer that has the layer mask applied to it. Pretty cool, huh? Join me in the next part of this video series where I explain reverse masking, because masking can be thought of in two different ways. Mask as a stencil, and a mask as a what's called rubylith layer.